In the summer of 64 AD, as flames devoured Rome, the Eternal City, witnesses claimed to see a figure silhouetted against the inferno, Emperor Nero, allegedly singing while his empire burned. But who was this man who turned the heart of civilization into a theater of horror? The answer lies in a tale so dark, so twisted with murder, matricide, and madness, it challenges our understanding of power's corruption. This is not merely a tyrant's story, but a chilling examination of how absolute power can transform a human into something monstrous. Nero's reign began with promise but descended into a nightmare that would echo through history as one of the most depraved examples of imperial excess. His name became synonymous with cruelty, his legacy written in blood and ash. The man who would become Rome's most infamous emperor was born into a world where family bonds meant nothing when weighed against political ambition. In the imperial court, mothers poisoned sons, wives murdered husbands, and children orchestrated the deaths of their parents. Nero would master all these dark arts, surpassing even his murderous predecessors in his capacity for evil. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero, entered the world on December 15, 37 AD, during the reign of his great-uncle, the mad Emperor Caligula. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, he was destined for greatness. But the seeds of his future depravity were planted in the toxic soil of imperial politics. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, died when Nero was just 3 years old, leaving the child in the care of his ambitious mother, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was no ordinary Roman matron. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula, the daughter of the beloved general Germanicus, and a woman whose hunger for power knew no bounds. Exiled by her brother for alleged adultery and conspiracy, she returned to Rome when Claudius became emperor in 41 AD. Her beauty was matched only by her ruthlessness, and she possessed the cunning of a master politician combined with the moral flexibility of a seasoned assassin. The young Nero grew up watching his mother manipulate the imperial court with deadly precision. He witnessed her seduce Emperor Claudius, becoming his fourth wife in 49 AD. He observed as she systematically eliminated rivals and consolidated power. In this environment, violence became normalized, and murder was simply another tool of statecraft. The boy who should have been learning philosophy and virtue was instead receiving a masterclass in assassination and betrayal. Under Agrippina's guidance, Nero's education was carefully crafted to serve her ambitions. She appointed the philosopher Seneca as his tutor, not out of concern for her son's moral development, but because Seneca had been recalled from exile and owed his position to her favor. The irony was profound. One of Rome's greatest moral philosophers was tasked with educating a future monster, though neither yet knew what the boy would become. The transformation of Claudius's heir apparent required the elimination of competition. Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, stood in Nero's path to the throne. Agrippina began her campaign of manipulation, convincing Claudius to adopt Nero in 50 AD. The emperor, already showing signs of age and perhaps the effects of gradual poisoning, proved malleable in his wife's hands. By 51 AD, Nero had been granted the title of Princeps Juventutis and was being groomed as the next emperor. The final act of this deadly drama unfolded in 54 AD. Emperor Claudius, after 14 years of rule, died suddenly at a dinner party. The official cause was listed as indigestion from eating poisonous mushrooms, but contemporary historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio suspected murder. The prime suspect was Agrippina herself, who allegedly used a servant named Locusta, a professional poisoner, to eliminate her husband before he could change his mind about the succession. With Claudius dead and Britannicus sidelined, the 16-year-old Nero ascended to the throne as the youngest Roman emperor in history. The Roman Senate, faced with a fait accompli, had little choice but to accept the new ruler. But they were not dealing with a naive boy. They were confronting a young man who had been systematically trained in the arts of deception and murder by one of history's most ruthless women. The early signs of Nero's reign seemed promising. Guided by Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, the young emperor appeared to embrace the responsibilities of leadership. His first speeches to the Senate were well received, promising respect for senatorial dignity and a return to the constitutional principles of Augustus. For a brief moment, it seemed that perhaps the nightmare of Caligula's reign would not be repeated. But beneath the surface, darker currents were already stirring. Nero's relationship with his mother, initially cooperative, began to sour as he chafed under her control. Agrippina had not eliminated Claudius and orchestrated her son's rise to power merely to become a background figure. She expected to rule through him, to be the power behind the throne. This expectation would prove to be her fatal miscalculation, for she had created a monster she could no longer control. The honeymoon period of Nero's reign lasted barely a year before the first drops of blood stained the imperial purple. The target was Britannicus, Claudius's biological son and the only remaining threat to Nero's legitimacy. Though only 14 years old, Britannicus represented everything Nero feared, a rival with a stronger claim to the throne and the potential to rally opposition to his rule. The boy's very existence was a constant reminder that Nero was an adoptive heir, not a blood descendant of the divine Julius Caesar. The murder of Britannicus in 55 AD marked Nero's transition from puppet emperor to active participant in the deadly games of imperial politics. The assassination was carefully planned and executed with a sophistication that belied the perpetrator's youth. At a dinner party in the palace, Britannicus was served a cup of wine that had been pre-tasted for poison, as was customary for members of the imperial family. When the boy complained that the wine was too hot, cold water was added to cool it, water that had been laced with a deadly toxin prepared by Locusta, the same poisoner who had allegedly killed Claudius. The poison acted swiftly and dramatically. Britannicus collapsed at the dining table, his body convulsing as the toxin attacked his nervous system. The other guests watched in horror as the young prince died before their eyes, foaming at the mouth and gasping for breath. Nero, displaying a callousness that would become his trademark, calmly ordered the dinner to continue, dismissing his stepbrother's death as merely an epileptic seizure. But everyone present knew they had witnessed murder, and they understood that a new and terrible chapter in Roman history had begun. The killing of Britannicus served multiple purposes beyond the mere elimination of a rival. It was Nero's declaration of independence from his mother's control and his first public demonstration of his willingness to kill family members who opposed him. The message was clear: no one, regardless of their relationship to the emperor, was safe if they threatened his power. The young men who had once been guided by the moral philosophy of Seneca had chosen a different path, one that led through blood and betrayal. Agrippina, witnessing her son's transformation, began to fear for her own safety. She had created a monster, but she had also made herself vulnerable to that monster's appetite for violence. The woman who had orchestrated the deaths of Emperor Claudius and potentially others found herself in the unfamiliar position of being a potential victim rather than a perpetrator. Her attempts to maintain influence over Nero only served to accelerate their conflict and seal her own fate. The murder of Britannicus also marked the beginning of Nero's psychological descent into madness. The ease with which he had ordered the death of his stepbrother, the lack of remorse he displayed afterward, and the pleasure he seemed to derive from the exercise of ultimate power over life and death all pointed to a fundamental corruption of his character. The boy who had been born into privilege and raised in luxury had discovered that the greatest luxury of all was the ability to kill without consequence. Roman society, accustomed to violence and political murder, nonetheless recoiled from the brazen assassination of a child at the imperial dining table. The senators who had hoped for a return to constitutional government under the young emperor's rule began to understand that they were dealing with something far worse than they had imagined. The precedent had been set: Nero would kill family members, children, anyone who stood in his way or displeased him. The poison that killed Britannicus was more than just a chemical compound, it was a metaphor for the corruption that was already eating away at Nero's soul. Each act of violence would make the next one easier. Each murder would lower the threshold for the next killing. The emperor who had begun his reign with promises of clemency and constitutional respect had revealed his true nature, and that nature was fundamentally predatory. In the aftermath of Britannicus's death, the imperial court became a place of whispered conversations and fearful glances. No one knew who might be next, and everyone understood that proximity to power now carried a potentially fatal risk. The young emperor had tasted blood, and like a predator that has made its first kill, he had discovered an appetite that would only grow stronger with feeding. The death of Britannicus was not just a political assassination, it was the birth of a serial killer who happened to wear the purple of imperial Rome. The boy who had died at that dinner table was not the only victim. He was merely the first in a long line of deaths that would follow as Nero's reign of terror began in earnest. Agrippina the Younger had spent her entire life navigating the treacherous waters of imperial politics, but she had never faced an opponent quite like her own son. As Nero's independence grew and his willingness to use violence became apparent, the woman who had orchestrated his rise to power found herself increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The death of Britannicus had been a clear message. Even family members were not safe from the emperor's wrath, and Agrippina understood that her position as the emperor's mother might not be enough to protect her. The relationship between mother and son had always been complex, built on mutual ambition rather than genuine affection. Agrippina had seen Nero as her path to ultimate power, while Nero had relied on his mother's political skills and ruthless efficiency to secure his throne. But as the young emperor matured, he began to resent his mother's attempts to control him and her expectations of sharing power. The woman who had been his greatest ally was becoming his most dangerous enemy. Their conflict came to a head over Nero's personal relationships and lifestyle choices. Agrippina disapproved of her son's affair with a freedwoman named Act, viewing the relationship as beneath imperial dignity and potentially threatening to the dynasty's prestige. She also objected to Nero's growing interest in public performances, chariot racing, and other activities that she considered undignified for an emperor. These disagreements might have remained private family matters, but in the imperial court, personal conflicts had political implications. The final rupture between mother and son occurred when Agrippina began to openly criticize Nero's rule and threaten to support alternative claimants to the throne. In a moment of desperate fury, she reportedly told her son that she could just as easily elevate another member of the imperial family to power, possibly even Britannicus if he was still alive. This threat, whether real or merely rhetorical, sealed her fate. Nero could not tolerate the existence of someone who had the knowledge, connections, and motivation to orchestrate his downfall. The emperor's decision to murder his mother represented a new level of depravity, even by the standards of imperial Rome. Matricide was considered one of the most heinous crimes in Roman culture, a violation of the most fundamental bonds of family and society. The fact that Nero was contemplating such an act demonstrated how completely he had abandoned any pretense of moral constraint. The student of Seneca's philosophy had become a monster who would stop at nothing to preserve his power. But killing Agrippina would not be as simple as poisoning Britannicus. The emperor's mother was a formidable opponent who had survived decades of court intrigue and multiple assassination attempts. She was constantly surrounded by loyal guards, careful about what she ate and drank, and deeply suspicious of anyone who might wish her harm. A direct approach would be difficult and risky, requiring careful planning and elaborate deception. Nero's solution was characteristically theatrical and overcomplicated. Rather than employing a simple poison or hiring an assassin, he devised an elaborate scheme involving a collapsible boat designed to sink and drown his mother during a pleasure cruise. The plan was both ingenious and absurd, reflecting Nero's love of dramatic spectacle and his belief that he could stage-manage reality like one of his theatrical performances. The emperor invited his mother to join him for a festival celebration at Baiae, a fashionable resort town on the Bay of Naples. The reconciliation between mother and son appeared genuine, with Nero displaying unusual warmth and affection toward Agrippina. They dined together, reminisced about the past, and seemed to have resolved their differences. But beneath the surface, deadly preparations were being made. The specially constructed boat was a masterpiece of engineering and treachery. Designed to collapse at a predetermined moment, it would create the appearance of a tragic accident while eliminating the emperor's most dangerous opponent. The plan required precise timing, skilled accomplices, and a considerable amount of luck. But Nero was confident that his theatrical instincts and careful preparation would ensure success where more conventional methods might fail. The assassination attempt on Agrippina in 59 AD would become one of the most notorious examples of Nero's twisted creativity and incompetence. The emperor's plan to murder his mother using a collapsible boat was ambitious in scope but fatally flawed in execution, demonstrating both his theatrical instincts and his fundamental inability to understand the difference between stage drama and real-world consequences. The plot would ultimately fail, but its aftermath would prove even more revealing about Nero's character than the original scheme. On the night of the planned assassination, Agrippina boarded the specially constructed vessel under the impression that she was being transported back to her villa after the festival celebrations. The boat appeared normal to casual observation, but hidden mechanisms had been installed to cause the deck to collapse and the hull to break apart once the ship reached deeper waters. Nero's engineers had designed what they believed to be the perfect murder weapon, a floating coffin that would claim its victim while providing the emperor with plausible deniability. The plan began to unravel almost immediately. As the boat moved away from shore, the mechanical devices designed to destroy the vessel malfunctioned, failing to collapse with the dramatic suddenness that Nero had envisioned. Instead of a quick and decisive sinking, the boat began to list and take on water gradually, giving the passengers time to realize that something was wrong. The crew members who were supposed to ensure Agrippina's death found themselves struggling with a half-broken ship and a very much alive imperial mother who was beginning to understand the true nature of her situation. In the chaos that followed, Agrippina's quick thinking and survival instincts saved her life. Rather than panicking as her son had expected, she maintained her composure and began swimming toward shore. The woman who had survived decades of imperial court intrigue proved equally capable of surviving a maritime assassination attempt. Her companion Acerronia was less fortunate. She was killed by the conspirators, who believed her to be Agrippina in the darkness and confusion of the sinking vessel. The news of his mother's survival reached Nero like a thunderbolt. The emperor, who had believed himself to be orchestrating the perfect crime, suddenly found himself facing the prospect of an enraged and very much alive Agrippina, who now knew beyond any doubt that her son had tried to kill her. The failed assassination had not eliminated his problem. It had made it infinitely worse by transforming his mother from a political opponent into a deadly enemy with nothing left to lose. Nero's reaction to the news revealed the depth of his panic and the primitive nature of his problem-solving instincts. Unable to accept the failure of his elaborate scheme, he immediately began planning a more direct approach. If theatrical murder had failed, he would resort to simple butchery. The emperor who had tried to stage-manage his mother's death like a scene from a play now abandoned all pretense of subtlety and opted for straightforward assassination. The final act of this deadly drama unfolded at Agrippina's villa, where she had taken refuge after her miraculous escape from the collapsing boat. Nero dispatched a team of Praetorian guards led by a freedman named Anicetus with orders to complete the task that the floating death trap had failed to accomplish. There would be no more elaborate schemes or theatrical flourishes, just soldiers with swords and a woman who had run out of places to hide. When the assassins arrived at her villa, Agrippina knew immediately why they had come. The woman who had orchestrated the deaths of emperors and rivals faced her own executioners with a courage that impressed even her killers. According to historical accounts, she bared her womb to the soldiers and told them to strike there, since it had carried the monster who now sought her death. Her final words were a mixture of defiance and tragic recognition of what her son had become. The murder of Agrippina was more than just another imperial assassination. It was a matricide that shocked even the violence-hardened Roman public. The emperor who had killed his own mother had crossed a line that even his most depraved predecessors had respected. The act was so fundamentally unnatural that it seemed to place Nero outside the boundaries of human civilization, transforming him from a tyrant into something approaching a beast. The aftermath of Agrippina's death revealed the full extent of Nero's psychological corruption. Rather than showing remorse or attempting to justify his actions, the emperor appeared to experience a sense of liberation and triumph. He had eliminated the last person who could effectively challenge his authority, and he had done so in a manner that demonstrated his absolute power over life and death. The student of philosophy had become a matricidal monster, and he seemed to revel in his transformation. With his mother's blood on his hands and no effective opposition remaining, Nero's reign entered its most decadent and destructive phase. The young emperor, who had once been constrained by advisors and family members, now found himself free to indulge his every whim and appetite. The result was a spectacular display of imperial excess that would have been comical if it were not so destructive to the Roman Empire and its people. Nero's transformation into a theatrical tyrant represented the complete corruption of absolute power and the total abandonment of imperial responsibility. The emperor's obsession with public performance became the defining characteristic of his later reign. Nero genuinely believed himself to be a talented artist, singer, and charioteer, and he demanded that his subjects share this delusion. He began performing publicly in theaters and circuses, forcing the Roman elite to attend his shows and applaud his mediocre performances. Senators and patricians who had once wielded real power found themselves reduced to the status of a captive audience, required to praise their emperor's artistic endeavors or face potential execution. These public performances were more than mere vanity projects. They were expressions of Nero's fundamental misunderstanding of imperial authority and Roman values. Traditional Roman culture valued duty, discipline, and dignitas above all else. Emperors were expected to be military leaders, administrators, and guardians of Roman traditions. By contrast, Nero's priorities were entirely self-serving and theatrical. He wanted to be admired, applauded, and celebrated as an artist rather than respected as a leader. The emperor's personal life became equally scandalous and destructive. His marriage to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, had been a political arrangement designed to strengthen his claim to the throne. But Nero found his wife boring and began pursuing other relationships with increasing boldness. His affair with Poppaea Sabina, the wife of his friend Otho, became public knowledge and a source of considerable scandal. The emperor, who should have been setting an example of Roman virtue, was instead flaunting his adultery and moral corruption. The relationship with Poppaea would prove to be another catalyst for violence and tragedy. Nero's infatuation with his mistress led him to divorce Octavia and marry Poppaea in 62 AD, but not before orchestrating his first wife's death on trumped-up charges of adultery. The execution of Octavia, who was popular with the Roman people, further damaged Nero's reputation and demonstrated his willingness to kill even innocent family members to satisfy his personal desires. But even marriage to his beloved Poppaea could not satisfy Nero's appetites or moderate his violent tendencies. In 65 AD, during Poppaea's second pregnancy, the emperor allegedly kicked her to death during a fit of rage. The specific circumstances of her death remain disputed by historians, but contemporary accounts describe a violent argument that ended with Nero striking his pregnant wife with such force that she died from her injuries. The emperor, who had once claimed to love Poppaea, had murdered her and their unborn child in a moment of uncontrolled fury. The death of Poppaea marked another milestone in Nero's descent into complete moral chaos. The emperor who had killed his stepbrother, his mother, and his first wife had now added his second wife and unborn child to his growing list of victims. Each murder seemed to make the next one easier, and each act of violence further eroded whatever remained of his humanity. The pattern was clear: anyone who came into close contact with Nero risked death, regardless of their relationship to him or their loyalty to his regime. The emperor's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable as his reign progressed. He would order executions on a whim, confiscate property to fund his extravagant lifestyle, and force prominent Romans to participate in his theatrical performances or face severe consequences. The imperial court became a surreal combination of theater and terror, where courtiers never knew whether they would be asked to applaud a song or witness an execution. Nero's artistic pretensions also extended to architecture and urban planning, but with characteristically destructive results. He began planning a massive palace complex called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, that would cover vast areas of central Rome. The project required the demolition of existing buildings and the displacement of thousands of residents. But the emperor viewed these inconveniences as merely the price of his artistic vision. The Golden House would become a symbol of Nero's megalomania and his complete disconnection from the needs and wishes of his subjects. The Roman people, who had initially hoped for stability and prosperity under their young emperor, found themselves living under an increasingly unstable and dangerous regime. Nero's theatrical performances, architectural projects, and personal scandals were expensive diversions that drained the imperial treasury and raised taxes. More importantly, they revealed an emperor who was more interested in his own entertainment than in governing effectively or protecting the empire's interests. On the night of July 18, 64 AD, a fire broke out in the shops lining the Circus Maximus, Rome's great chariot racing stadium. What began as a localized blaze quickly spread through the densely packed neighborhoods of the ancient city, fed by summer winds and the wooden construction of most Roman buildings. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire raged through Rome, destroying entire districts and leaving hundreds of thousands of people homeless. When the flames finally died down, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been damaged or completely destroyed, and the Eternal City lay in smoldering ruins. The Great Fire of Rome was one of the most devastating disasters in ancient history. But it would be remembered not just for its destruction, but for the rumors and accusations that surrounded it. Almost immediately, whispers began to spread through the traumatized population that Emperor Nero had started the fire deliberately, either to clear land for his massive palace project or simply for his own twisted entertainment. The image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned became one of history's most enduring legends, though historians note that the fiddle had not yet been invented, and Nero was actually in Antium, 35 miles from Rome, when the fire began. Whether or not Nero started the fire, his response to the disaster revealed both his administrative capabilities and his fundamental callousness toward human suffering. On the positive side, the emperor did organize relief efforts, opening public buildings and his own gardens to house the homeless and importing grain from neighboring regions to prevent famine. He also implemented new building codes requiring wider streets and fire-resistant construction materials to prevent future disasters. These measures demonstrated that Nero was capable of effective leadership when circumstances demanded it. However, the emperor's behavior during and after the fire also provided ammunition for his critics and enemies. Stories circulated that he had climbed to a high tower to watch the flames and had sung his own composition about the fall of Troy while the city burned around him. Whether these accounts were true or merely propaganda, they reflected the Roman people's growing belief that their emperor was fundamentally indifferent to their welfare and capable of treating their suffering as entertainment. The fire's aftermath presented Nero with both an opportunity and a problem. The vast cleared areas in the heart of Rome provided perfect space for his planned Golden House, and the emperor wasted no time in beginning construction of his massive palace complex. The new building would cover over 100 acres and feature elaborate gardens, artificial lakes, and architectural innovations that pushed the boundaries of Roman engineering. But the project also required enormous resources. At a time when the city desperately needed funds for reconstruction and relief efforts, Nero resorted to increasingly desperate measures to finance his architectural ambitions and the broader rebuilding effort. He raised taxes, confiscated property from wealthy Romans, and debased the currency by reducing the silver content of coins. These economic policies further damaged his relationship with the Roman elite and created widespread hardship among the general population. The emperor, who should have been focused on healing his city's wounds, was instead using the disaster as an excuse to pursue his own grandiose projects. The search for scapegoats in the wake of the Great Fire led to one of the most notorious episodes of Nero's reign, the first large-scale persecution of Christians in Roman history. The Christian community in Rome was small but visible, and their refusal to participate in traditional Roman religious practices made them natural targets for suspicion and blame. Nero, whether from genuine belief in their guilt or simply from political opportunism, decided to make the Christians pay for the fire with their lives. The persecution that followed was characterized by a creativity and cruelty that revealed the depths of Nero's sadistic imagination. Christians were not simply executed, they were turned into public entertainment. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by wild dogs in the arena. Others were crucified along the roads leading into Rome. Most infamously, some were covered with pitch and burned alive as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens during evening parties. The emperor, who had allegedly sung while Rome burned, now used burning Christians as decorative lighting for his social gatherings. The spectacle of Christians being burned alive in Nero's gardens became one of the defining images of his reign and helped cement his reputation as a monster. Even Romans who had no sympathy for Christian beliefs were horrified by the gratuitous cruelty of these executions. The persecution revealed not just Nero's capacity for violence, but his complete disconnection from normal human empathy and his willingness to transform suffering into entertainment. By 65 AD, Nero's reign had become so oppressive and erratic that even his most loyal supporters began to question whether the empire could survive under his continued leadership. The emperor's theatrical obsessions, fiscal irresponsibility, and casual brutality had created a climate of fear and uncertainty that extended from the imperial court to the furthest provinces. It was in this atmosphere of growing desperation that a group of senators, knights, and military officers began to plot the most serious assassination attempt of Nero's reign, the Conspiracy of Piso. The conspiracy was named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a wealthy and respected senator who had been chosen to replace Nero as emperor. Piso was everything that Nero was not: dignified, cultured, and committed to traditional Roman values. He had served with distinction in various governmental positions and was widely regarded as a man of integrity and competence. The conspirators believed that his elevation to the throne would restore stability to the empire and end the nightmare of Nero's rule. The plot involved a remarkable cross-section of Roman society, indicating just how widespread opposition to Nero had become. Among the conspirators were senators like Flavius Scaevinus and Afranius Quintianus, knights like Claudius Senecio, and military officers including the tribune Subrius Flavus. Even more significantly, the conspiracy included members of Nero's own Praetorian Guard, the elite troops whose primary duty was to protect the emperor's life. The participation of these guards indicated that even those closest to Nero had lost faith in his leadership. The plan itself was relatively straightforward. The conspirators would assassinate Nero during the games at the Circus Maximus, where the emperor would be surrounded by crowds and relatively vulnerable to attack. Flavius Scaevinus would approach Nero under the pretense of presenting a petition, then stab him with a concealed dagger. Other conspirators positioned throughout the circus would ensure that the deed was completed and that Piso could be proclaimed emperor before news of Nero's death could spread to his supporters. The conspiracy might have succeeded if not for the participation of a freedwoman named Epicharis, who attempted to recruit additional supporters from among the fleet commanders at Misenum. Her approach to Volusius Proculus, a naval officer, proved to be a fatal mistake. Proculus, either from loyalty to Nero or from fear of the consequences of treason, reported the conspiracy to the emperor. The revelation of the plot set in motion a brutal investigation that would ultimately claim dozens of lives and further demonstrate Nero's capacity for paranoid violence. Nero's response to the discovery of the conspiracy was swift and merciless. The emperor, who had survived primarily through luck and the incompetence of his enemies, now faced the reality that significant portions of the Roman elite wanted him dead. His reaction was to unleash a reign of terror that made his previous cruelty seem restrained by comparison. Arrests began immediately, and the emperor's investigators used torture and intimidation to extract confessions and identify additional conspirators. The trials and executions that followed revealed both the extent of opposition to Nero's rule and the emperor's fundamental paranoia about threats to his power. Many of those executed were probably innocent of any involvement in the conspiracy, but they had made the mistake of criticizing the emperor or expressing sympathy for his opponents. The investigation became a tool for settling personal scores and eliminating potential rivals, expanding far beyond the original plot to encompass anyone who might pose a threat to Nero's continued reign. Among the most tragic victims of the emperor's paranoia was his former tutor, the philosopher Seneca. Despite his role in moderating Nero's early reign and his attempts to instill moral principles in his student, Seneca was implicated in the conspiracy and ordered to commit suicide. The old philosopher, who had spent his life studying virtue and wisdom, was forced to open his veins in a hot bath while dictating his final thoughts to his secretary. His death symbolized the complete triumph of tyranny over reason and the failure of education to prevent moral corruption. The poet Lucan, Seneca's nephew and one of Rome's most talented writers, was also executed for his alleged involvement in the plot. Before his death, he recited lines from his own epic poem about the Roman civil wars, creating a final moment of artistic defiance against tyranny. The emperor who fancied himself an artist was systematically destroying the real artists and intellectuals of his time, leaving Rome culturally impoverished and morally bankrupt. The suppression of the Pisonian conspiracy marked a turning point in Nero's reign, transforming him from a theatrical tyrant into a paranoid dictator who saw enemies everywhere. The emperor who had once sought popularity and applause now ruled through fear and intimidation, trusting no one and viewing every citizen as a potential assassin. The conspiracy's failure ensured that Nero would remain in power, but it also guaranteed that his remaining years would be characterized by increasing isolation, paranoia, and violence. The years following the Pisonian conspiracy saw Nero's complete transformation from emperor to monster, as paranoia and megalomania consumed whatever remained of his sanity. The man who had once shown flashes of administrative competence and genuine concern for his subjects now ruled Rome like a mad tyrant from the darkest myths of antiquity. His behavior became so erratic and destructive that even his most sycophantic courtiers began to fear for their lives, and the Roman people started to whisper that perhaps the gods themselves had abandoned their city to this monster's whims. The emperor's artistic pretensions reached new heights of absurdity and expense during this period. Nero began planning a tour of Greece, where he would compete in various artistic and athletic competitions, convinced that he would demonstrate his superior talents to the world. The very idea of a Roman emperor participating in Greek games was scandalous to traditional Romans, but Nero's desire for artistic recognition had overcome any concern for imperial dignity or Roman customs. He spent enormous sums preparing for this tour, commissioning costumes, training coaches, and elaborate theatrical productions. The Greek tour, when it finally occurred in 67 AD, became a grotesque parody of artistic competition. Nero entered numerous contests for singing, acting, and chariot racing, and, not surprisingly, he won every single event he entered. The judges, terrified of offending the emperor who held the power of life and death over them, awarded him victory regardless of his actual performance. Nero returned to Rome with over 1,800 crowns and prizes, genuinely believing that he had demonstrated his artistic superiority to the world. While the emperor was indulging his artistic fantasies in Greece, the Roman Empire was facing serious challenges that required competent leadership. Provincial governors were struggling with barbarian incursions, tax collection was becoming increasingly difficult, and the imperial treasury was nearly empty due to Nero's extravagant spending. But the emperor showed little interest in these mundane administrative matters, preferring to focus on his artistic pursuits and theatrical projects. The final crisis of Nero's reign began in 68 AD with a rebellion led by Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis. Vindex's revolt was not initially a serious military threat, but it represented something far more dangerous to Nero's continued rule, a public rejection of his authority by a senior imperial official. The rebellion encouraged other provincial governors to question their loyalty to an emperor who seemed more interested in singing than in governing, and it revealed the extent to which Nero's authority had been undermined by his own behavior. The emperor's response to Vindex's rebellion was characteristically theatrical and ineffective. Rather than immediately mobilizing the legions to suppress the revolt, Nero spent precious time planning elaborate punishments for the rebels and designing new theatrical performances to celebrate his eventual victory. When he finally did respond militarily, it was with a combination of overconfidence and incompetence that reflected his complete disconnection from political and military reality. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared his support for Vindex and proclaimed himself